Good afternoon, participants, and welcome back from lunch. My name is Jennifer DeGrees. I'm an eye care prevention specialist, and I have with me Mr. Melvin Sanders, who is also a prevention specialist, and he will be monitoring the chat for us today. I will be introducing a wonderful, amazing presenter, but before I do that, I wanted to let you know that at the end of today's presentation, if you could please click, not only do your evaluation link, but also click on the knock knock advertisement link. That would be wonderful, so you can see what's there and available for you to do on that link. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Rachael Smith. She is a traffic safety resource prosecutor for Louisiana. She works for the Louisiana District Attorneys Association in Baton Rouge. She has been in this position since 2015. Rachael works under a highway safety grant, providing impaired driving training, education, resources, and legal assistance to prosecutors and law enforcement. May I present Rachael Smith?
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Y'all, I am honored to be here today. This is a little bit different audience than I usually have. Like Jennifer said, my job is called a traffic safety resource prosecutor. So, in a nutshell, I'm usually training law enforcement officers and prosecutors on anything to do with impaired driving. So, I'm hoping today's presentation gives y'all some information that's relevant to you. But if I do get off into the weeds or if you have any questions, I am going to save about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. So if y'all could, we'll try to find them earlier in the chat, but if you wanted to just jot them down and save them for the end, that'd be great. That being said, I will have some questions for y'all. So I would love if y'all could just throw your answers in the chat when I ask. And we will go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about marijuana and traffic safety. And a lot of times when we're thinking about marijuana users or like what they're using, we're thinking kind of old school, kind of, Cheech and Chong or dazed and confused, all right, all right, all right. But in reality, now that 18 states have legalized marijuana for adult use, as well as Washington, D.C., we're seeing a much broader demographic of users and a much wider variety of what they're actually using. So this is a shot of a dispensary. I don't know if y'all have had a chance to go to any of the dispensaries in states where it's been legalized for adult use. I've actually been in a couple just for recon purposes, of course. But I'll say my first impression when I went in one, I was at a impaired driving conference in Denver, and there's a dispensary across the street. So we're like, hey, let's check it out. You walk in and it looked like the Apple store. I mean, this is a very sophisticated operation with everything under the sun you can think of that can be infused with cannabis. They've done it. So that's kind of what we're looking at. But the thing is, those products don't just stay in the states where it's been legalized. These are all evidence that has been turned into the crime lab in North Louisiana. This was all seized in criminal cases in the Alexandria area. So you can see these products are things that really kind of appeal to kids. And I want to point out the THC content that it says 400 milligrams of THC. THC is the cannabinoid in marijuana that gets you high. So it's the active impairing cannabinoid that we're testing for usually. And 400 milligrams is a lot. If you need a point of reference, when I'm looking at studies on impaired driving, they can do a lot more studies on this now that it has been legalized in some states, but it still has to be, government sanctioned. Like they have to get permissions from the government. And the highest dose that I've seen in any of the impaired driving studies that they're allowed to dose people with in real life was 25 milligrams. So just kind of keep those sorts of things in mind throughout. What we're seeing in real life is a lot different than what we see in the studies, right? This is another example of evidence that was seized again in Alexandria. We've got some special Doritos. Spoiler alert, Frito-Lay did not make these Doritos. So they're probably made illegally, but they've got all of the markings that you would see on products that are sold legally in these states. So that's what makes differentiating these products really difficult once it's been legalized. And again, I want to point out the THC content, 600 milligrams, y'all. That is crazy. That's a lot. So this is another thing we're seeing a lot in the states where marijuana has been legalized. Okay, so I want to go back in time. In the 70s or so, when they grew marijuana, the actual plant, the flower, where you get the THC, the part you want to smoke, was about 3 to 5% THC potency. Nowadays, with science and hydroponics and all that good stuff, they can grow the plant at about 30% THC potency on the high end. But then you've got some really resourceful folks, some entrepreneurial folks who are like, okay, well, we want to get more of the good stuff. So they figured out ways to apply heat and chemical solvents and extract that THC from the flower into a really concentrated form that can usually be smoked. And these concentrates, they can get up to like 80 to 90% THC potency. So what do you do with this? Well, usually you smoke it. This is an example of, it's called a dab rig. So you get a little bit of the concentrate, or just a dab, right? Light it with a blowtorch. What could go wrong? And smoke it. And if anyone's got any, stuff to return from the holidays, there's some ideas out there. I say that facetiously. But I think even just this little clip shows us just how normalized these sorts of things are becoming. So I wanted to show y'all a video of someone using dabs. And keep in mind, like I said, everything's different now. We're not seeing in real life what we're seeing in the studies because we can't dose people with something that's 90% THC positive. So a lot of times, even if someone has used marijuana before, they're not ready for the effects that you see with something like these high potency concentrates. So let's play this video real quick. So there's a million videos on the internet about like that. And I was looking for some more insight on using these kinds of products and, what people are thinking when they're using them, and found the collective wisdom on Reddit, right? The place where you go for the answers. So this guy says, why do I pass out with dabs? I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but, he says it concerns him. I think that would be enough, to make me pause and think, if I'm passing out, that's not a good thing. And then you've got folks that respond and say, this is really strong stuff. I was high for 9 hours. And what I want y'all to think about for the purposes of this presentation, for 9 hours, is that person going to get in a car at any point? Are they going to decide to drive at any point? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, a lot of times. This is another headline. This was in Michigan, I think. And sadly, it was homecoming night. And they've got a Snapchat video that they find afterwards. This Boy and his friends do some dabs. Kid passes out in the Snapchat video, but then apparently comes to, gets in the car, goes for a drive, and passes out again. He didn't hit the brake when he got in the way of the semi truck. So these are the sorts of headlines we're seeing with the sorts of products that are out there now. And to that end, it's no surprise that we're seeing a significant increase in marijuana impaired driving. So this study was actually done by some Canadian folks. Canada legalized marijuana for recreational use in 2019. And some academics up there start thinking, okay, could this be a problem as far as impaired driving goes? And where could we go to look at it and find out? Hey, how about some of those southern states where it's been legalized for a while? Colorado and Washington were the first two states to legalize, and that was in about 2012. So in this study, they're looking at 11 different states where marijuana has been legalized, and they're looking at the rates of fatal crashes before legalization and after legalization. And they found that on average in those states, the rate of fatal crashes went up 15% and deaths up 16%. Another place I went to look for data on this, which kind of surprised me because I'd never thought about it before, but it makes total sense. Insurance companies, right? Of course, they're going to have good data on crash rates and claims and injuries and that kind of stuff that they could narrow down on a statewide basis. And they have done their own study, and they were looking at a different time period, and they're only looking at 5 states. But they found that within those 5 states, and they were actually doing their comparison to the states surrounding the 5 legalized states where it hadn't been legalized. And they found that the crash rates had gone up 5 to 7% on average in those states where marijuana had been legalized. Another place where we get some really good data is out of Washington State. So I said that it was one of the first states to legalize, and for our purposes, it's also a really good source of data because they have a centralized crime lab system. So they've got one crime lab at the top and everything else is under its umbrella. So they found that just 2 years after legalization, the number of folks, I guess it was drivers actually, in fatal crashes, the number of people with THC in their system had nearly doubled in just 2 years. And it's not something we're just seeing in those states where marijuana has been legalized. We're seeing it across the country, including in Louisiana. So these are stats from the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab, and they show the top 5 drugs found in blood draws that are taken in impaired driving cases and turned into the crime lab for testing. So you can see back in 2014, THC is down here in 10% of the cases. It's not even the most common thing they're seeing. But then by 2015, it is the most common drug that they're seeing, and it just continues to go up from there. And at this point, we see marijuana in about 50% of all of the blood draws that are turned in to LSP, to State Police Crime Lab, for testing in impaired driving cases. So I want to talk a little bit about what's actually happening, what the body's actually doing with the drug when someone is impaired. When the crime lab is testing for toxicology purposes, they're testing for a whole panel of drugs. And when it comes to marijuana, they're looking for 3 things. So we talked about that delta 9 THC. That's the active impairing cannabinoid. That's what makes you high. They're also testing for the hydroxy metabolite. So this is a metabolite of using THC, but it's also impairing. It can still get you high. And then finally, they're testing for the carboxy metabolite. So carboxy can stay in your system up to 30 days, and it's the inactive metabolite. So it's not going to get you high. And since it can stay in your system for so long, it's not what we look to show recent use. So just because someone tests positive for carboxy, we don't know, we can't say necessarily that they were impaired when they were driving a car at this date and time, right? It just means that they have used at some point in the past. So when people talk about it staying in your system for so long, they're talking about this carboxy. Now, the first two things, this would be better evidence of more recent use. So when we talk about impaired driving cases, first question for y'all, think your drunk driving case, your alcohol impaired driving case. What do y'all think one of the first things we're looking for as a prosecutor is in these cases when you've got your alcohol impaired driver? Just throw your answer in the chat. Anyone got a guess? Or what happens when you take a breath test? Well, ding, 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 Jackie Myers. Yep, the blood alcohol level. So when we've got an alcohol impaired driving case, that BAC is very important to us because we've got a law that says that if you are a 0.08 blood alcohol content or higher, that you are too impaired to drive. So that's a key piece of evidence for us. And we've got decades of research on this, and we understand this, and we've got expectations that that number will tell us something. So we want to know naturally, well, what's the number for marijuana? How much is too much before you're impaired? And unfortunately, I got to burst your bubble here because alcohol acts differently than most other drugs of impairment, including marijuana. So we have to understand those differences. Alcohol is hydrophilic. So it's water loving, it's water soluble. When we drink it or ingest it, then it wants to go to our blood, which is water, right? And it hangs out there. And when we get that blood draw or breath test, that pretty much directly correlates to a level of impairment. But marijuana is different. So marijuana is lipophilic. It's fat loving, fat soluble. So we ingest it and it wants to get through the blood as quick as it can so it can get to the fatty tissue in our body, like the brain, where it is impairing. So that's why you might have an officer who stops someone, observes that they're very impaired, ultimately gets a blood test, and the THC level could be very low. It could even be zero. But it doesn't mean that person wasn't impaired because it's already in the brain when the impairment's happening, even if it's already gone through the blood. So I like to use this study to show just how quickly the THC can go through the blood. So this was 20 people and they were dosed with THC. And after 10 minutes, well, incrementally, they get blood draws from them, right? So after 10 minutes, the average THC in the blood of those 20 people is 38.2 nanograms. Less than an hour and a half later, so hour and 15 minutes after that first reading, it's already down to 4. Some folks are already at 0. So less than an hour and a half after dosing, and it's already gone down by 90%. But that doesn't mean that they were not impaired. So this graph shows us what we just talked about. The pink line is your THC in the blood when it's smoked. So you can see it rapidly goes up, rapidly falls. But the impairment, the actual performance, something that a third party could observe, something that the officer could observe or you could observe, the green line, they're still impaired. And the subjective feeling, how high do you feel on a scale to 1 to 10? Still impaired, even though that level in the blood has gone down. Now, this pink line can be a little bit different if you've ingested, say, an edible, right? Something that's not smoked or inhaled. And in those cases, we see, again, here's our smoked, the blue line. But if it's an edible, then we see it takes a lot longer for the THC in the blood to peak and a lot longer to go down. So a lot of times we see issues with this with folks who maybe don't use marijuana very often. A lot of times in the states where it's been legalized, you've got tourists who get there and they're like, hey, I want to try this thing. So they go buy, their marijuana gummies and it's 3 to the pack and it says 1 gummy is 1 serving. I don't know about y'all. I'm not stopping at 1 gummy bear. But what happens is people eat 1, they don't feel anything. So they eat 2, still not feeling anything. Before you notice it, they've finished the pack, and then it hits them because it can take so much longer to be absorbed through the stomach lining in your system, right? So this was pretty much what a reporter found when she went to Colorado to kind of cover this firsthand. Maureen Dowd, she's a fairly prominent reporter with the New York Times, goes to Colorado, gets her a chocolate bar, goes to her hotel room, going to have a nice night. She says she ate their chocolate and then she spent the next 8 hours in a hallucinatory state, just waiting for it to be over. So these are some of the issues that we see and hear about anecdotally with all of these products that are out there. But when it comes to impaired driving, ultimately, all of the science has concluded at this point that because of everything we just talked about, that there's no one number that's going to correlate to a specific level of impairment. That's what NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, concluded. That's what the chiefs of police and the National Safety Council concluded. Basically, they're telling us there's no 0.08 for marijuana. So, what I like to tell people is that the number, the toxicology results, it's not a silver bullet. It may not be a 0.08, but it could still be really helpful. I like to think of it as icing on the cake. Cake's still pretty good without the icing, usually, I hope, if you get a good chocolate sheet cake. And what that icing can do for you, what the tox results can do, is confirm what the officer observed, right? Corroborate what the officer saw, and can strengthen your case. So what do we do in these cases if we don't have that silver bullet, if we don't have tox result? Well, I wanted to briefly talk about our impaired driving law in Louisiana. This is a little snippet of it. We are prohibited from operating the law says any motorized means of conveyance. So in Louisiana, that's basically anything with a motor. So it could be a car, could be a boat as long as it's got a motor. I have seen a DWI on a lawnmower. In Louisiana, it cannot be a bicycle or a canoe or a horse. So that's kind of a sidebar, but helpful info. And then if it's marijuana impairment, it would fall under this subsection, which prohibits use of being under the influence of a scheduled drug, which marijuana is still a Schedule I drug in Louisiana and federally. So what do we do if we don't have that silver bullet to hang our hat on? We are looking for everything in these cases, starting with the driving behavior. What is that officer observing? Next question for y'all, and it is kind of a trick question, I'll warn you. What do you think the most common reasons are for the stop of cannabis or marijuana impaired drivers in the states where it's been legalized? Because that's where we're getting the data from. What is the most common reason folks are stopped for impaired driving, do you think? Give y'all about 15 seconds to answer, and I can tell you it's probably not the first thing you're thinking. Got it. Driving too slow. Yep, y'all got it. So most people, oh, wait, actually, it's the opposite of that. I'm sorry. I've done this so many times, I've started to lose track. It's actually the opposite. It's speeding. Everyone thinks it would be driving too slow, but it turns out the most common reason for the stop is speeding, followed by weaving, which is something we frequently see with impaired drivers in general. So hopefully we've got an officer who's gone to some advanced training and they are documenting all of these little things, because it's many little things that turn out to be important pieces of the puzzle. So after they've made the stop, they make contact with the driver and they may start to notice things like they have a hard time opening the door of the car or locating their license and registration. So they're noticing an inability to execute fine movements. Or maybe they keep asking the officer to repeat themselves, like keep asking them to tell them directions again. We see that a lot, and we want officers to document those sorts of things. When we think about alcohol impairment, a lot of times we're thinking of a really physical manifestation, right? People are falling over, right? They might look sloppy, they might be stumbling. With marijuana, and again, everything is qualified by, it depends on what exactly they used. You know, if it's a high potency product, all of what I'm about to say might not apply, or maybe they might look more physically impaired. But in general, marijuana is a more cognitive impairment. So it's impairing your executive functions, right? Your ability to focus on things, your ability to make decisions, to do small things, little tasks. So after that officer has made contact with the driver, they might ask them to do some field sobriety tests, ultimately ask them to do a breath test. If that breath test comes back 0, but they say this person is definitely impaired, then they may call an another officer out. It's called a drug recognition expert. So a drug recognition expert is an officer who has gone through advanced training. It's about 90 plus hours, both classroom and in the field. And they are taught to administer a 12-step evaluation where they're looking for different physical objective signs and symptoms. And they're doing this in order to determine whether someone is impaired by one or more of these 7 drug categories. So if it's cannabis impairment, then these are some of the things that we could expect to see. You might see a lack of convergence, which means that your eyes don't cross. You might see dilated pupils. You might see a high pulse, high blood pressure. Cannabis causes both of those. Just a sidebar. I read a study recently. I get all of the studies on marijuana, whether it's impaired driving or not, and sometimes they're just interesting to read. But I saw one recently that said that folks who use marijuana regularly were twice as likely to have a heart attack before the age of 45, which made sense to me considering I know, based on just my knowledge of our DRE program, that it causes your blood pressure to go up. Not a good thing. So this is one of our most helpful studies in my line of work, and we call it the 302 study. And in this study, they had 302 individual DWI cases where the officer, where there was a DRE evaluation and the officer concluded that it was only cannabis that was impairing the person, and the toxicology results came back cannabis only. So of those 302 cases, they're looking for what do these things have in common? What are the most reliable indicators of impairment that we see throughout these cases? And it's a lot of the things that we saw on the DRE matrix, so elevated pulse, dilated pupils, rebound dilation, lack of convergence, but also impairment on 2 of 4 psychophysical tests. So y'all probably have seen these on TV. We call them standardized field sobriety tests usually. It's what you see someone doing on the side of the road, usually if they're being tested for impairment. So the walk and turn test, the one leg stand test, the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, where you have to follow a stimulus with your eyes. Officers do these tests to detect impairment, whether it's by alcohol or some other drug. And the way these work is that they evaluate someone's ability to divide their attention. So to do a mental task and a physical task at the same time. So I have to hold my leg up for 30 seconds and count while I'm doing it. Or I have to take 9 steps and count and turn around and take 9 more. And we need this ability to divide our attention for things like information processing, balance, coordination, muscle control, all things we need for driving, right? For reacting to traffic, for steering, braking, that sort of thing. What's coming after the red ball? A kid, right? So if I'm impaired by marijuana, okay, let's think about eyes being dilated. Think about when you leave the eye doctor and they've dilated your eyes and they give you those spiffy little sunglasses to wear. Think about if you weren't wearing those sunglasses and you step out into a bright day. Your vision is potentially going to be impaired, right? Or if it's nighttime and your eyes are dilated and there's oncoming headlights, you may have a problem with your vision. Even if I do see the red ball, if I'm impaired by marijuana and my reactions are delayed, then I may have a problem once I see the red ball. My brain still has to tell my foot to slam on the brakes or to swerve out of the way. And if my reactions are delayed, I may not be able to do that in time. So that's why being able to evaluate someone's ability to divide their attention is so important. And we've got studies that tell us that SFSTs are useful for detecting impairment by marijuana as well as other drugs. So at the end of the day, it's not one thing we're hanging our hat on. It's not just the tox results. It's everything. It's everything that officer has observed. It's the results of the DRE evaluation. It's the tox results, confirming all of that, and a prosecutor who hopefully has gone to some training and knows how to wrap this up in a pretty bow. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what the landscape in Louisiana is looking like right now as far as legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana. In 2016, we passed legislation to enable a medical marijuana program in Louisiana. And at the time it was passed, it was probably one of the most highly regulated medical marijuana programs in the country. As y'all probably know, we only have two growers. It's the LSU Ag Center and Southern University's Agricultural Center. And so we're not, like, by our statute, people do not grow their own medical marijuana, right? It's not to grow for personal use. So we've got those two providers. And originally in 2016, there were only about 7 conditions that made you eligible to receive the medical marijuana. And they were all really, really diseases that were very diagnosable. So really serious conditions like cancer, wasting disease. I think glaucoma was on the original list. But then every year since then, they've added things. So at this point, we've got more than 21 different eligible conditions, which now include autism, intractable pain, PTSD. So you can see with those additions, we've seen quite an increase in patients that are eligible for this and that are actually getting the medical marijuana recommendations. Another major change that happened recently in 2016 and for the continuing 4 to 5 years, the law specifically prohibited any smokable form of the raw or crude marijuana. So it was only being dispensed in forms like tinctures and lozenges, and I think they had, something topical. And eventually they got an inhaler, kind of like a dosed inhaler like you would use for asthma, but with the medical marijuana in it. But then in the last legislative session, the 21 session, they actually removed that prohibition on the raw or crude marijuana. So as of January 1 of this year, the actual plant flower, right, the part with the THC, is now being sold as medical marijuana. So that's why we've seen, hundreds of people lining up at the dispensaries now. And I think we're going to see a huge increase in numbers of recommendations and probably numbers of users after January 1 of this year. Now, I regularly attend the prescription monitoring program meetings, and our pharmacy board also regulates or keeps an eye on the marijuana dispensaries and numbers of patients, numbers of recommendations. It's not a prescription, right? Because this is not a federally recognized legal drug. So it's not an actual prescription. It's called a recommendation, but it's basically, another word for prescription. So this shows the most recent data we've got, and you can see how those numbers of prescriptions have just continued to rise, as well as the patient numbers going up significantly. And you see just a large part of that increase just last year. The numbers started going up as soon as that law passed, even though the flower wasn't actually for sale yet. So I'm expecting we will see it way up here once we get those first quarter numbers from this year. And with that, I would expect to see probably an increase in impaired driving in Louisiana. Now, we have had several bills filed in the last few sessions that would legalize marijuana for recreational use in Louisiana. We had about 15 bills filed that would result in legalized marijuana last session. But the most comprehensive one would have done many things. It would have decriminalized, so completely take it out of the criminal code. It would have allowed marijuana for adult recreational use, would have allowed people to have up to 6 plants in their personal possession, and it set up a regulatory scheme for it. Now, this didn't pass. The bill that did pass it didn't decriminalize per se, but it took it took the jail time basically out of the statute for 14 grams or less. So now possession for 14 grams or less is a $100 fine, and that's pretty much it. So that was a big change. Now I want to take a moment to look at another state where they have legalized marijuana for recreational use, and some of the lessons that they've learned there. So I have the opportunity to work with folks with my job in other states, and I work really closely with Colorado and their TSRP, which has really benefited us in being able to teach about these sorts of things. So I want to give a shout out and thank you to my colleague Jen Knutson in Colorado, who shared some of these slides with us. And right off the bat, I think it's important to know that all of Colorado you're not able to buy marijuana everywhere in Colorado. 67% of the counties there have banned its sale for recreational use because they don't want it after they've seen some of the effects. A lot of times these laws are passed because people see giant revenue amounts for the state. And while that can be true, it usually takes several years. At the end of the day, it's still less than 1% of Colorado's actual budget. But I think we have to be really mindful of some of the consequences that come with that, some of the things that maybe offset those dollars and cents. We have seen a significant increase in marijuana impaired fatalities. So on our roadways, our impaired driving in Colorado. You also see that the illegal markets, the illicit markets really flourish under these circumstances. If it's legal to possess marijuana, right? You're supposed to get permitted. There's a lot of regulations you're supposed to be following, but at the end of the day, if I want to grow my own plant, how's that officer going to know whether it was legal or illegally grown? And then a lot of times these products are sold for less, right? They can sell them for cheaper than they would at the dispensaries, or they divert them out of state to places like Louisiana, where we end up getting things like the Captain Toast Crunch, right? The Captain MUNCH in Alexandria. Another huge toll we see is on the healthcare system. So I know this is an impaired driving presentation, but I think some of the effects are worth talking about, especially for this audience. They've seen an exponential increase in admissions to the emergency room and poison control center calls for children under 5 and for teenagers. And I think that's because for teenagers, it's destigmatized, right? People want to try things, but also so many of these products are appealing to kids, right? Everything I showed you, Doritos, the what was it, the little cereal things. A lot of times it's gummies, candies. So that is definitely something to be mindful of when this legislation is proposed. Another place, when we're looking at studies, a lot of the impaired driving studies they're relatively new, within the last 10 years, and we've been able to do a lot more now that it has been legalized in some places. But one place that there is so much work that's already been done, there's so much documented research, is the connection between marijuana use and mental health, especially for kids. You see a lot of studies on the effects for people younger than 25 and how it affects the brain. So this slide specifically, we're seeing a lot more research on the connection between marijuana and psychosis, especially if you use regularly, especially if you're using these high potency products. So we'll see people have complete breaks with reality. They'll have psychotic episodes. They're actually connecting it, to schizophrenia. So we don't know if it exacerbates an already present condition or if it's, there's the whole causation correlation issue, but there's a lot of research being done on those sorts of things now. But it's hard to study because we can't dose people with the amounts that they're actually using in real life. So this is one of those really tragic stories and one of hundreds that you can see in just a quick search. This was a kid who went to Colorado for a ski vacation with his friends. They buy some edibles. He takes some, ends up taking a lot, probably, didn't feel anything. His friends are wanting to go to dinner, but he's acting weird. They say he's quiet, he won't talk to him, he's kind of jittery. They go to dinner and he ends up killing himself. So those are the sorts of things we're seeing with these high potency products. Now, I want to wrap it up with talking about public perceptions of marijuana and how that relates to impaired driving. So this is an actual picture of the Colorado State Capitol on April 20th, 420. And you can just see all of the people that are there, and it's really become destigmatized. And with that feeling that it's okay, we see things like this. You've got to grow inside in the kids' room. And at the end of the day, when it comes to impaired driving, a lot of times people now think, especially in places like that it's natural, right? It grows from the earth. It's legal. So they don't really connect the problem of using it and then driving. But in my world, we say impairment is impairment, right? Whether it's by prescription drugs or alcohol or marijuana. So a lot of research on public studies and public perceptions has been done and says that you have to connect people's knowledge of what they know is bad. So we know you're not supposed to drink and drive, right? So you've got to draw that connection between drinking and driving is bad to using marijuana and driving is bad. They both impair you. They can both have really horrible consequences. So I want to end with what I think is a really impactful PSA. It's actually from Australia, and I think really depicts some of the ways in which marijuana impairment can be more subtle, right? Some of that subtle cognitive impairment as opposed to your sloppy drunk, but can still end in the same way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. How about you?
Don't know really.
Yeah, we were talking about maybe going down to the pub and seeing some bands or something. So
Yeah, I might do that. Yeah, that sounds good actually. Who's playing?
Hey, Matt, come on, we gotta get going.
Now, can we stay a bit more?
No.
Yeah, all right. Come on. Gotta go.
See ya.
You got the keys? Yeah.
Woo! No, you got him. Bye. Is it fun? God, she's so cute, Bella. She's like a weird. I can't believe we've got a kid.
Hollow based.
Me too. It's clear, babe.
Oh.
You sure you should be driving?
Yeah, I'm fine.
All right, Mike. Make up your mind. Is it fast or slow?
Okay, you drive. Yeah.
Oh, it gets me every time. So that is the presentation, right? I hope y'all have gotten some helpful information. I'd be happy to take any questions now. I know, wasn't ready. Okay, I'm going to scroll up here, and my tech wizard, Shar, is going to throw the questions up on the screen. Let me see if we've got anything. I saw someone ask, let's see, about whether the prescription monitoring, oh, thank you, about whether the prescription monitoring program also monitors the medical marijuana, and they do. Let's see. Okay, so Kira Luckett at 1239 says, are companies like Doritos getting paid under the table in those states where marijuana is legalized? As far as I can find out, I don't think they are. I don't think these products are being manufactured by Frito-Lay at all. I was actually just before this presentation, because I use that slide a lot, and I know I'd looked into this before, but I needed to refresh. So I was like looking at actual Dorito bags next to these bags, and you can see copyright marks, on the actual bags, and that it's manufactured by Frito-Lay, and none of that is actually on, the magic Dorito bag. So I would, I'm surprised there aren't more lawsuits that we read about in relation to that. Let's see. How do they measure THC at a traffic stop? That is Gina Lewis at 1248. Well, they don't measure it at the stop. We want officers to be observed. We hope that they've gone to some training, and anything that they observe that indicates that this person might be impaired, we hope that they are documenting those things. Ultimately, the person will take a breath test, which obviously doesn't measure THC. If those breath test results are inconsistent with the level of impairment that the officer's seeing, so if they blow a 0 or, maybe 0.02, but this person's just fall down, or even not fall down, if they're just impaired, then the officer will probably get a search warrant for a blood draw, and that's where we would get the tox results from. And just a side note on that note, there's a lot of research right now that shows that if you combine alcohol and THC, it's like the level of impairment is extreme. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2 situation. It's more of a 1 + 1 = 10 kind of thing. Let's see. I got y'all with the driving too slow. Everyone does that, even cops. Let's see. Okay, does it show on a person's PMP report like other drugs? Yes, it would. That is something that the pharmacists are supposed to be monitoring to make sure people aren't, doctor shopping or going to multiple dispensaries to get more than they're legally entitled to at this point. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Is my office providing educational outreach to schools? My grant is specifically for impaired driving training for law enforcement and prosecutors. It's NHTSA money has all kinds of classifications, and the bit that we get is specifically for a law enforcement training program. So I don't proactively go out to the schools, but I'm happy to do anything when asked. And law enforcement, actually, especially state police or maybe your local sheriff's offices, but state police has a lot of really excellent presentations and multi-day programs that cover where they've got officers who their entire role and focus is special events and working with kids for these sorts of trainings and programming. So if that's something you're interested in for your schools, I'm sure we could set you up with Troop A here in Baton Rouge. And they even do, it's called sudden impact, where they bring a crashed car out to the scene and kind of go through the whole tragic story. And we also statewide have, it's part of our Department of Transportation, but also a NHTSA mandate. We have a statewide plan to reduce impaired driving, and it's got multiple sections, and one of those is for young drivers. So I know if y'all were looking for more programming to that end, we could get you in touch with the right people. Where is the video you located that you just shared? It's on the internet. And if you send me an email, I would be happy to send you a Dropbox link with it, because I mean, I've got it on my desktop. Yes, I can definitely, you know what? I could.
If you send it to me, I can share it in the chat. If you send me
Okay. Okay. I'd have to look for it. I don't, have it on YouTube at my fingertips, but is there a way to send it out to the attendees from this?
We'll talk later.
Okay. Okay. But if you want to, if anyone needs it, ASAP, just shoot me an email. Is my email address on here? Yes. Easy, RACHEL @ldaa.org. And I'd be happy to get that to y'all. Let's see, anything else? I appreciate all of the feedback. Thank you, thank you. Looks like we've got about 3 more minutes. If there were any more questions, I'm happy to respond. And otherwise, I thank y'all for having me. It's really been an honor, and I appreciate, getting to talk to different groups. We can't hear you, Jennifer.
Oh, okay. Hello?
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm finally on now. Well, we wanted to thank you so much because your presentation was absolutely wonderful, very informative. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we just wanted to thank you for coming on today. You did a great job. The information was wonderful, and the video was definitely shocking, but much needed, for a lot of us to be able to see and maybe even to show our students. So thank you for coming on. You did a great job, and we appreciate you.
It's my pleasure. Thank y'all.
Have a great day.
You too.
And to the participants, please make sure that you do your evaluation link before 4:30 today, because that's whenever it will close. Also, make sure that you try and look at the link for the Knock Knock Museum advertisement. And as far as certificates, they will be mailed out to you within 2 weeks.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.